Okay, hi everyone. My name is Daniel Murphy. No, it's not. It's not really. You can tell there's a science crowd because nobody knows who Daniel Murphy is. I'm Dan Fagin, and I'm the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program here at NYU. And we are very glad to have you here. It's wonderful to see this many people here, people I know and alumni from SHRP, and also folks I don't know, friends of our guests, friends from the science writing community in New York. And that is really a great tribute to what our guest today is up to, and that's Steve Silberman. And I will wait and have Lee, as usual, Lee Hotz, give as usual a very erudite introduction to our wonderful guest. But I will just say that I personally am really excited that Steve is here. I'm excited about his book, which is a really important book, and we're thrilled to have him here on such a timely basis when the book is fresh and new and is very much the talk of the science writing world. I'm also very glad that he's here. Well, let's just say I was disturbed at the timing, this being, for New York Mets fans, we've waited a very, 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 very long time for this. But there's a rain delay in Kansas City, and so that means that we can take our sweet time and have a great discussion with Steve. So with that, Steve, I'll just say thank you very much for coming all the way from California. And at this time, I will turn the mic over, as always, to Robert Lee Hotz, Jr., distinguished writer in residence here at the Carter Institute of Journalism and science writer for the Wall Street Journal. Take it away, Lee.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. And Dan, thank you very much for arranging the rain delay.
I have powers.
Yeah. And I understand that's the subject of your next book. So, well, thank you, everybody. Welcome. We're here this evening to turn science journalism inside out. We're engaged in an exercise here in forensic journalism. It's our aim, with your help, to dissect the best work of our profession. We want to seek clues to state of mind, reporting technique, motive, writing practice, and the idea is to better understand our craft and maybe improve our own work. So, for those of you who've been here before, this is our third of 4 sessions this fall. In a way, what we've been doing is tracking the story of story this fall. We began in September with science editor Tim Appenzeller, who helped us understand a bit of just what strange ideas lurk in the minds of editors and what they're looking for in terms of story and how they structure things. And then earlier this month, we stayed a while with Christy Schwanden, who helped us better understand the secrets of nailing down an assignment and the joys of heritage poultry. And on November 17th, we'll conclude by talking with globe-trotting science and environment reporter Hillary Rosner to explore the lengths to which a good science journalist must go in pursuit of a good story, in this case to the ends of the earth and back. But this evening, and I want to emphasize this for those of you who are new, this is a conversation, not a lecture. So, as we get rolling, interrupt, please. Help us digress in creative ways. But if I may ask, please get the microphone first. Our bat boy there has got it, and he'll willingly yield it to a good question. So, we begin tonight where so many of all science stories seem to end, which is with the publication, the successful publication, of an in-depth article in a national magazine. The story was called The Geek Syndrome. It appeared in Wired magazine, attracted a lot of attention. The writer, our guest this evening, Steve Silberman, who I may say has very kindly flown all the way from San Francisco to be with us. Now, Steve is a reporter who for a decade or so was stalked by this story because it wouldn't let go. And the result is the book that you see before us, NeuroTribes, The Legacy of Autism and the Future of Neurodiversity. Now, you should understand that Steve intersects many circles. If you love the literature of the Beat generation, you'll know him because as a young man, he was Allen Ginsberg's teaching assistant at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado, at the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. If you're a rock music fan, you'll know him as a Deadhead of serious proportions, because he in fact won a gold record from the Recording Industry of America for co-producing the Grateful Dead's career-spanning box set, So Many Roads, which covered their music from 1965 to 1995. And that was, I should say, Rolling Stone's box set of the year. But he's also written liner notes for CDs and DVDs for Crosby, Stills and Nash, the Jerry Garcia Band, many other groups. And he's in fact co-author of the 1994 Skeleton Key, a dictionary for deadheads, if you were really serious about this, as some of us are. And I will say, if you ever ate at the Hayes Street Grill in San Francisco, you may recognize him because he probably served you seafood. He was there as a waiter for 11 years. But if you're a science journalist, you know Steve because he's an award-winning writer whose articles have appeared in Wired, The New Yorker, the MIT Technology Review, Nature, Salon, and many other publications that we swear by. And his article, The Placebo Problem, won the 2010 Science Journalism Award for magazine writing from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And I will say featured prominently on the Colbert Report. Now, his writing on science and culture and literature has been collected in a number of major anthologies, including the Best American Science Writing of the Year and Best Business Stories of the Year, an unusual combination. And he is a social media maven. His Twitter account was dubbed by Time Magazine one of the best Twitter feeds of the year. He has 45,171 followers. And if you're wondering why this room is crowded, 3,000 friends on Facebook. His TED Talk this past March on the forgotten history of autism, which arises from his research on this book, has been viewed so far by 1 million viewers, and it's been translated into 22 languages. But here he is. Before us is the author of NeuroTribes, which the late Oliver Sacks called a, quote, sweeping and penetrating history, presented with a rare sympathy and sensitivity. And I hope to take advantage of both during our conversation this evening. Now, I started by talking about your many circles, and of course circles have no real beginning or end, but your career has been taken a particularly circuitous route.
Yeah.
If I may, let's start when you were 5.
Okay.
You got a poetry assignment. What happened?
Oh my God. Such deep reporting. I'm really impressed. Yes, I won a Fordham University poetry contest with a poem called The Math Battle about how I could not deal with numbers. And that was my first experience of being a published author. So there was a very serious picture of me taken like this when I was in like 5th grade. And that poem ended up getting translated and sent to Expo 67, which happened in the previous century for the young people in the room. Yeah, so that was my first experience of being a writer. I actually do remember, I didn't tell you about this in our pre-interview, but I do remember the first moment that I ever thought I might be a writer, which was, I was walking around Fresh Meadows in Queens because I grew up in New York, and I was walking down a block away from our apartment, and I realized that there was a sentence that was continuously unfolding in my head, that my thoughts were words. It was like a river of words, and I thought, oh, I wonder if I'm a writer. And so that was like the first time, other people think in pictures or, but I thought in one continuous unspooling sentence, and it's still unspooling.
Do you remember the beginning of the sentence?
No, I don't. I have no
Okay.
idea. I mean, it was probably, maybe I'm a writer.
Could have been.
But yeah, no, that was the first moment that I realized I was a word person.
Yeah, we discovered that mirror in the mind.
Yeah, and the one thing I will say is that my late father, Donald, used to carry me around on his shoulders reading James Joyce's Ulysses aloud. So that the sound of those phonemes must have penetrated at some level.
So you won your prize, you wrote your poem. I mean, it was in a kind of a way, a kind of a science writing assignment, I guess, the way you handled it. Just kind of infected you with the idea of becoming a poet, or did that become later?
No, it did. I mean, it infected me with the idea of becoming a writer. And so then when I was in, I mean, this seems like really, is this interesting? I mean, you know.
If you think, if you're worried about being boring, I promise you I'll start making things up.
Okay, good. Yes, well, when I started reading probably the poetry of Allen Ginsberg in junior high school, I not only liked it, I felt like I really related to it, as if he was a me who had gotten into the world earlier and could tip me off to stuff. And, you know, I look back now and that's completely naive. It's like, the Beatles' music was, you know, speaking directly to me, you know, or something. But everybody felt that way about Allen, at least the people around him. But, you know, eventually I ended up seeing Allen in person giving a poetry reading.
Right.
And he was the most embodied, happy, alert, awake, middle-aged man, you know, probably my age at the time now, that I had ever seen in my life. And I thought to it was like a big moment. Like if, you know, if I was a Tibetan Buddhist, it would be like, that's the moment I recognize my guru, you know.
What?
And so I saw him on stage at Queens College, and I said, wherever that guy's gonna be next summer, I'm gonna like rent an apartment across the street and, you know, buy cat litter if that's what he needs, or, you know, do whatever that guy needs. That guy is cool. Like I somehow had this feeling that he was gonna be important in my life. And I trusted that feeling, and I actually was that guy. It turned out that he taught at Naropa Institute, and I sold everything I had actually, and went to Naropa. I had written him a letter to try to get an apprenticeship with him at Naropa. He never replied, so I really had to go on a wing and a prayer. Waited in line because of course he was surrounded by groupies more or less, and so I waited and I said, "Hi, Alan, I'm Steve Silberman," and he said, "Oh, you wrote me that very nice letter." So I thought, oh, that's good. And so then when I got back to the dorm room I was staying in, there was a note on the door that said, "Mr. Ginsberg would like to offer you an apprenticeship. Please go see him at Varsity Apartments," or whatever. So that was the beginning of that. And that was really a valuable experience because it was the first time I saw what writers were like in their everyday lives. Like not just a picture on a book jacket or even a mythical figure from the Beat Generation, but the guy eating cornflakes in his t-shirt, you know, at the table. And he had, you know, it was like the phone was ringing, it would be Bob Dylan or whatever. You know, like I saw that, like, yeah, you know, literally Bob Dylan. Like I saw not only what a writer's life was like, but what it was like to be at the center of a sort of global network of fascinating thinkers before there was an internet. So Alan's Rolodex was like the killer internet kind of smart people in many different fields. And if you just hung out at that table in his apartment, fascinating people would walk in. Like I remember one day this musicologist who was figuring out how to play ancient Greek scores of music was there, started talking, and then this dancer decided she would do dance to those scores, and so to music that hadn't been heard in centuries. So I got to see like what a really hooked in guy was like with this fascinating global network of thinkers. It was like, I wanted to be that guy when I grew up.
Right, and you're not sitting there thinking like, you know, I should copy numbers out of his Rolodex because it's going to be really helpful for me.
No.
When I'm a science journalist, you're
Right.
you're not headed that way at all.
No, I wasn't. But the science thing, actually, I must admit, I've never said this aloud, I have to say. The science thing came out of science fiction. It came out of my youthful, I was fascinated by science fiction.
So who did you like? Robert Heinlein, people like that?
Yeah, and there was an anthology called Dangerous Visions, edited by Harlan Ellison.
Harlan Ellison, yeah.
And so it was like cutting edge. Like, I mean, Carol here is actually much more qualified to talk about Harlan Ellison than I am. But you know, he was sort of it was almost like proto-cyberpunk in a way, like you know, edgy, really edgy science fiction. And I love that there was a Dangerous Visions anthology and again Dangerous Visions. I love that stuff. They were innovative with form and with content, and I just loved science fiction. There was a movie that I became obsessed with by a young director that no one had ever heard of. This movie played at the theater in Fresh Meadows. I saw it maybe 10 times when it was there. It was only playing at 10 theaters across the country by an unknown young director named George Lucas.
Oh,
the movie THX 1138. And still, the first 7 minutes or so of THX 1138, which of course you can see on YouTube, is still one of the most completely mind-blowing bits of science fiction ever done. Like, if you're into science fiction and you haven't seen that movie, go look at that first 7 minutes, because it's a montage of sounds that puts you directly into a very believable, palpable world of the future without any exposition. You're just there. Like, this is a long time ago in a galaxy far from, you're there. And it's completely fascinating. Although, interestingly enough, it's an analog future. It's not a digital future. But anyway.
That's a point. That's a point.
Yeah.
So, in the Bay Area,
Yeah.
in the galaxy, a long, long time ago.
Yes.
So how did you get from Europa to the Bay Area? How did you actually get started? I mean, you had
Okay.
no interest in, that I can detect at this particular point in being anything except a poet whose work, like people that you had sort of seen in Europa, it actually had a profound effect on people, actually had a shot at changing the world.
Well, that was the thing. Yes, I wrote poetry for years. I would give poetry readings in the Mission at anarchist bookstores, and my 15 friends would dutifully come and tell me it was cool, and I totally didn't trust that, like it was like, wait a minute, like of course my friends are telling me the poetry is cool, but who cares really, And I never had the sense that I was making anything happen with poetry. Like, I was just writing more poems for people who read poems. And I don't want to diss poetry, because I still read it. I think it's amazing. I'm still interested in it. But what poetry wasn't by this point, which was the early 80s in San Francisco, it wasn't the world-shaking thing that it had been when Alan read Howl in the late 50s. And so Allen Ginsberg had changed the world, really changed the world with a poem. And I just felt like it wasn't going to happen for me. Like I wasn't good enough, or poetry wasn't in that position anymore, or something.
Well, certainly the culture had moved on.
Right.
And had, in some respects, probably for that kind of effect, had moved on to rock.
Yes.
But
which Alan knew, by the way, yeah.
But I have to ask you, many people would be satisfied with poetry simply as a form of self-expression.
Yeah.
But if I'm hearing you correctly, self-expression for Steve Silberman is not enough.
That's actually a very insightful thing. Thank you. Yeah, self-expression. Who cares? That's great. Self-expression. Who cares? I mean, we all have selves. They're here for a while. They go away. But one of the things that I inherited from my parents, who were, by the way, communists. I know it's
not
right.
I forgot that. Yes.
Right.
not quite a red diaper baby, but
no,
close.
Pretty much. Yeah,
okay.
New left red diaper.
New
baby.
left red diaper.
And
baby.
so.
FBI files.
Yes, there was big FBI
people
files.
taking down license plate numbers.
Yes,
following,
my parents felt that our phone was bugged, which it probably was. So, and my father actually went to jail for organizing a protest against the Vietnam War. He was fired from several jobs because of his radical politics. So I grew up, my mother ran for Congress as an independent candidate. So I grew up knowing that the established order of things, the mainstream world, was not looking out for my interests. I grew up, I don't want to say paranoid, but I felt that like the police were not our friends exactly,
Yeah.
And I remember being dragged through clouds of tear gas with my mother holding her knit hat over my nose and mouth in Washington, D.C., and seeing billy club wielding policemen coming down the steps of the Department of Justice, novelistically enough. So, I grew up feeling like we were outsiders.
Okay, yeah, so you're an outsider.
Yeah.
And you're an outsider, though, at a time when the outside, I mean, I say in your own youth, young adulthood, where the outside had like a pretty healthy culture going for itself.
Oh, exactly.
So there was a place to go to be outside.
That's true, that's true.
But I want to take you back. So there you are in the anarchist bookshop reading poetry to 15 of your friends, and it's just not cutting it for you.
Right, right. So I wanted my writing to do something. I wanted it to effect change, and I wanted it to somehow make the world better for people who are suffering. I mean, it sounds all exalted now, but that's what I wanted, And so I started doing journalism, and I was writing for the San Francisco Chronicle on paper.
You were writing music essays, really.
Culture.
Culture.
Not just
all right,
music,
all right.
yeah.
Culture.
But,
define culture for us. Because a lot of us here are science journalists. We haven't got a clue, so.
Well, frankly, I forget what I wrote about really, but I was writing like Sunday supplement feature, personal reflections with blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
But it's funny, I got my first taste of the ephemerality of fame one day when I had something on the cover. There was a picture of me and Allen Ginsberg actually on the cover of the Sunday magazine. And one day I saw that the cover blowing up the street in the wind. But anyway, so so I started doing journalism. And then the way that I got into science journalism was through poetry, believe it or not, was that I was the personal assistant at Allen's request of a relatively obscure but excellent beat poet named Philip Whalen, who appears in Jack Kerouac's books. And by then he was an old blind Zen master. And so he needed someone to do his correspondence. And so I did that. And every day he would say stuff about Kerouac or Ginsberg or whoever that I knew was not in history books because I'd read them all. So I thought, I can't just let this stuff disappear into the air. Something had come along right then that made it very easy to preserve those remarks: the internet. So this was the early 1990s. I was in an online community called The Well, which many of you know about. And so I started a topic about basically stuff that Philip Whalen would say to me. And one of the people who read that topic was a guy named Gary Wolfe, who was working at, he was helping to plan the launch of Wired, which was Wired magazine's website. Websites at that point were so new that I had to tell my mom, no, you can't go to the store and buy a copy, I'm sorry. You need a computer, And so one day Gary invited me down to Wired for lunch. I assumed we were gonna have lunch. Suddenly I'm meeting everybody there. And I said, Gary, this is really nice, but why am I meeting everyone here? And he said, I want you to be the senior editor of Wired. Just on the basis of my stuff about Philip Whalen on The Well. So I did it. And I was like the old guy in the office, basically. Almost everybody there was, it was their first job out of college, and they were like sleeping under the desks.
For a second though, back up. Set the culture for us at this point. I mean, Wired was an incredible publishing phenomenon when it sort of appeared on the scene, and there was a whole zeitgeist of the web-aborning and the idea that journalism could even be committed in an ethereal form.
That's true. Inside Wired, we used to joke, Wired, the magazine for people cooler than you'll ever be. And Wired had like this fierce, like almost punk, but high gloss punk, but attitude. People would constantly complain, I can't read those fonts,
right?
Those colors, and we thought it was great, So Wired was the first commercial web magazine, whatever that is. We invented ad banners, sorry. But here was the thing. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was on the leading edge of something instead of the trailing edge of something. Like for people my age, I'm very old, I'm 57. So for people my age, it's like we grew up through the whole 60s stuff. It was like we'd get to the party just as everyone had vomited and was leaving, basically. And so, oh God, like we were constantly cleaning up after our slightly older brother's messes, And so to be working on the web in 1995, I started working full-time on the web in August 1995, which I remember because the first piece I ever wrote for Wired was an obituary for Jerry Garcia, actually. And it was the first time I ever felt like I am right at the moment of inception of something really major and new. Like I remember just a couple years earlier, I'd seen my first hyperlink and clicked it. Hyperlinks, like, we're so tired of them now. It's like we don't even see them anymore. They're invisible. Hyperlink was a magical thing the first time that you ever saw it, if you grew up without that. And the web was unbelievable. And plus I was with people who were so cool, and I don't mean cool like snotty or hipsters. I mean like they were so creative that they would do stuff, put it on the web, and within 2 weeks, everybody would be imitating it. So it's like they came up with, like when I first started working at Hotwired, gray background web pages were the standard, and if anybody remembers that. But these kids had figured out how to make colored backgrounds and images in the background, and they were hacking stuff, and it was brilliant. It was wonderful.
Right, and I'm just sitting here with my mouth open because I have no idea how you fit in.
Oh, I was game.
You were game.
Yeah,
I mean, you have
game.
no discernible technical skills, right? I mean,
none.
None, right?
Zero.
You have. I mean, I realize we'll get to this later, but you have no science background, so you're not like. No, you're not coming out of Stanford with a doctorate that you don't know.
No degrees.
Don't know what to do with.
But I was fanatically interested in science the whole time.
You were.
I was.
Because we've missed that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So science fiction and science. I was.
Well, right.
I was
but
always
science,
fascinated by science.
Okay, science fiction, right?
Right. So it was lay. No, I didn't have any formal training.
That's all right.
But I was always very interested in it.
Anything in particular? I mean,
a
how
lot
does
of
one
things
be
in
interested in
particular.
science?
Well, I mean, AIDS was happening. I was following that.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I was always interested in space. I was fascinated
Was there a
by
particular
space.
entry point?
I can't remember.
Yeah, I mean, some people got jazzed because we landed on the moon. Some people got
landing on the
grabbed
moon.
because their friends
Unbelievable.
were dying. I mean, it could be
both.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, so in other words, I had a healthy lay interest in. I don't want to elevate it into something it wasn't,
No.
I had a healthy lay interest in science at the same time. So Wired, basically, what I started doing was doing daily news. We launched a web native news service called Wired News, and there was.
And what was news for a Wired native?
Well, I'll give you an example.
I wish you would.
The first story that I ever wrote that was published for Wired News was about how a disgruntled gay programmer had inserted gay characters in a very popular video game at the higher levels. So it was like, if you got to the high level, it was one of the sim games. Actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So if you got to a high level, suddenly you'd see guys in bikinis too, and it was too late to take them out before the game shipped for Christmas. So the company was completely freaking out. Yes? Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Are you him? You're not him, are you? Yeah. Right. So I wrote this story for Wired News, and the New York Times stole it, basically. Like what happened was this reporter called me up and he said, "Oh, great story about the sim game. Would you mind giving me your contact list because we want to write a follow-up?" Well, the next day the story did run on the front page of the New York Times, but there was somehow no reference to my story. And when I wrote, I was so intimidated, like I didn't know if I should even write him and be pissed off, but I wrote him and I was like, "Really? You couldn't mention that I'd written a story?" He said, "My editor took it out." So anyway, but that was good. Stealing is the good form of flattery in journalism, sort of.
So, okay, here you are at Wired. You're writing. You're at the crest of the wave. And you were a feature writer at Wired for, 15 years.
Yeah, I got poached by the magazine.
You got poached by the magazine.
Yeah.
So I guess from my standpoint, you've raced up the ladder of interesting journalism jobs. I mean, a critic for the social critic for the San Francisco Chronicle, a restaurant reviewer for San Francisco Magazine. You're a startup editor at Hotwired, and then the next thing you know, you're at Wired, and all of us would like to kill you.
Well, here's the thing. I had a lot of ambition, building up in me that I could never express. I had originally tried to get a job at the Chronicle as a coffee boy, literally. And, I couldn't get that job. Every job seemed to be clogged with baby boomers.
Yeah.
Seriously. And so I wanted to do stuff, and suddenly like getting on the web somehow enabled me to do stuff and engage and to exercise my faculties at large, as the poet Charles Olson said. I wanted to have an effect on the world, interact with the world. I'm kind of prolific, i.e. I will not bloody shut up, and so I write a lot. And people seem to like it, mostly. Some people really hate it, but yeah.
So I'm curious, as a working environment, you're talking about a moment when people are kind of inventing what we'll now call online journalism in a lot of ways. And at Wired, at a very high order. This is not the kind of, is a blogger really a journalist argument or whatever. So what I'm curious about is how self-conscious you all were about what you were doing.
Not us all. I was very.
Very self-conscious.
Yes, the kids who were working in Hotwired who were adorable. And like if
Would you define kid here for a moment,
people who
so
just
I
got
can
out
tell
of,
just who in the audience you're offending?
Okay, yes, people who just got out of college.
Okay.
As I say, they were sleeping under desks. The really hot engineers would have hickeys all over their necks in the morning. If one person got a cold, everyone got a cold. There was like dub reggae, blasting on big speakers. You could totally get high on the roof, and people did, and including, I believe, the editor-in-chief at some point of the website. But here's the thing. One thing I forgot to mention, which is very important, was that the new journalism of like the Tom Wolfe era, like the electric Kool-Aid acid test, had a huge effect on me. Like I love that stuff. I thought it was amazing. Like it was almost like I got a thrill from it that probably some people get from video games. Like seeing words used that way. It felt like very live language and very live reporting. Now I look back, it's a little tacky in certain ways, but but at the time it was like, wow, like this is amazing, And so with the invention of the web and the launch of Hotwired, I felt like, oh, this is somehow new journalism, which actually was a phrase that was used and was instantly nauseating. But yes, it felt like a new wave in journalism. So I was very happy to be part of that.
So tell us a little bit about your work habits.
Oh, I work a lot, but all right. Well, I mean, the work habits for the book were very different.
Well, we're going to get into that.
Okay,
That's why I need to kind of do a little groundwork. I'll tell you what, let's use an example.
Okay.
Let's talk about the work habits, and we'll use the Geek Syndrome, the Wired feature that eventually kind of not led directly to this, but kind of lit the fuse.
Okay.
So it's a classic, 7,000 word lead feature, I guess?
Yeah. It was supposed to be the cover, but then
well, tell us a little bit about how this came to be. So it's a story about the apparent rise of autism. Have you guys all heard
this story? I feel like I've told it in like 50 interviews.
No, they're much too young, Steve.
Okay, all right. I was on a boat in Alaska with more than 100 computer programmers, and we were cruising towards the Arctic Circle. The occasion was something called a Geek Cruise, which was an entrepreneur's attempt to have tech conferences outside of boring hotels in Pittsburgh.
And that was the story you were covering, ostensibly?
At first.
Well, right, no, I understand.
Right.
You weren't sent there to do a story about autism in Silicon Valley.
No.
You were sent there to do a story
about the Geek Cruise. That story is out there too, by the way.
Yeah.
So, so I go on the Geek Cruise. I know, like, it was the first time that I was ever with a lot of hardcore programmers all at once who were sort of in their own space and making their own culture. And they definitely seemed like a tribe to me. Like, if the word tribe, they seemed like they got each other in some way. And some of them were very socially awkward. Some of them were self-medicating every night in the bar. They'd have to be carried back to their stateroom, literally. But they were fascinating. They were brilliant. I got to sit at the wizards table because I was a reporter. The wizards, who were these very high-level programmers, would have these fascinating conversations like, do the gliding, I forget, it was something about the gliding tones in Cantonese opera. Why are so many programmers also musicians? Like, it was a completely fascinating conversation every night. Larry Wall, who invented one of the most widely used programming languages in the world, something called Perl. Perl is in everything. It's in Amazon, it's in Microsoft software, it's in Craigslist. the duct tape of the internet, Perl hackers call it. So Larry Wall, the inventor of Perl, was this very eccentric but very wonderful guy. He put like Tolkien quotes in the source code, and all this. And so towards the end of the cruise, I asked Larry if I could interview him at home in Silicon Valley. And he said, yeah, sure. By the way, we have an autistic daughter. And at that point, it was the year 2000. I didn't know much about autism beyond Rain Man, like most people, by the way. Like it's actually, I really want to make the point that it's hard to remember now when autism was not almost a daily topic of conversation. In the year 2000, it was not yet. It was becoming one, but because those cliches about autism in Silicon Valley were just starting to be minted back then. But I thought autism was
And you were doing the minting.
Yeah, right, I did some of the minting, but I thought autism was a very, very rare neurological condition, that the chance of me meeting an autistic adult in real life, and by the way, I welcome my autistic friends who are here tonight, who are in this room. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for joining us.
The chances of my meeting an autistic person in real life were very slim, So he said that, I thought, oh, okay. So I went to his home in Silicon Valley. She was not there. I did notice things that would become significant later, which was that he had swapped the buzzer on his clothes dryer out for a tiny light bulb. So instead of going, when the cycle is done, this little light would light up. And it was only later that I connected that sensory sensitivity with his daughter's autism. But he was a wonderful guy, told me great stories, very essentially rebellious person, which I've come to actually believe is interwoven with autism in interesting ways. But anyway, so that happened. A few months later, I was writing another story. It was a profile of an entrepreneur couple in Silicon Valley. I asked the sister-in-law of the woman I was profiling if I could come visit her in Silicon Valley. That the family I was writing about, the patriarch of the family, had built the first computer in Israel way back in the 40s or 50s or whatever. So can I come to visit your house? And the sister-in-law said, yeah, sure. I should tell you, we have an autistic daughter. And I thought, God, that's odd. 2 families in Silicon Valley with this rare neurological condition. And so I was telling that exact story in a cafe in San Francisco. And this woman at the next table said, oh my God, do you realize what's going on? And I said, what's going on? And she said, I'm a special education teacher in Silicon Valley. There's an epidemic of autism in Silicon Valley. Something terrible is happening to our children.
Yeah, the epidemic word.
Right, the epidemic word, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. They just did. Like the power of that remark, still, it was like, wow, really? And so my immediate impulse was like, I have to find out if this is bullshit or not. Really? Is there an epidemic of autism?
So you had gone ahead, though, and written these other stories. I mean, you wrote the nice
Right, I wrote
profile
those other
about
stories, right.
The guy who invented Perl. You did the
Yeah.
nice story about the person who...
Right.
Yeah, so
Right.
these are just kind of outtakes, if you like.
Yeah.
They're just in the back of your mind. I mean, I'm just curious now as you work, do you take copious notes? Do you file stuff? Or you?
Yeah, I
you
take
a pack
copious
rat?
notes
Are you
and
a pack
yeah.
rat? So you would have had stuff left over.
Yeah, right.
All
I'm
go
a
ahead.
digital pack rat. Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
And so, so I wrote the Geek Syndrome. Looking back, I don't remember exactly how long I had to write it. One thing I do remember was I used to walk up the hill to UCSF, which has one of the best medical libraries in the country. So there were all these journals, and so I was researching epidemiology, genetics, environmental toxins. People were already very much talking about vaccines because Andrew Wakefield had already had his, infamous press conference.
Yeah. But as a journalist, you're coming to this new. You're not like,
right. No.
I'm well schooled in epidemiology.
No.
You're not going to fool me with the cancer cluster. So
Right, exactly. Right, here's the thing. If I have a method, it's to over-prepare. I read so much more. I do really, I must say, I read really a lot because I don't want to look like a fool. I hate reading news stories where you say well, really? If you really know about the subject, the story is, lame or whatever. I hate that feeling. And I never want it attached to my byline. I want people to say, You know, like even people in the field, I want them to learn from what I write. So, so I over-prepared for Geek Syndrome. And there was an idea that was being introduced simultaneously by Simon Baron-Cohen in England and the guy who told me, a geneticist who's now at UCLA named Dan Geschwind, that what was happening in Silicon Valley was called assortative mating. Assortative mating is when two people who are carrying genes, I'm oversimplifying, but two people who are carrying genes for a certain set of traits, if they get together and have a kid, those traits will be concentrated. And so the theory was that high-tech communities were creating social opportunities for people on the spectrum, you know, who maybe not were diagnosable but had autistic traits. And one thing I picked up on back then was that a lot of parents were figuring out that they were autistic once their kids were diagnosed. Like that was kind of a new thing. Because actually the diagnosis I didn't realize until I wrote Geek Syndrome, I didn't realize how recently the diagnosis had become available to adults. Here's the thing. We look back at Rain Man, and like young autism advocates look back at Rain Man and they say, such a cliche, you know, the autistic savant. It was not a cliche at the time. To see an autistic adult on screen was huge at that point. It was completely revolutionary. And it was the first autistic adult that almost anyone had ever seen, including even people in the autism community, actually. They still thought of autism as a childhood disorder. So, so basically, I forget where I was going.
Yeah,
with
I know.
that.
I'm going to pull you back.
Yeah.
So you're working on this story, and
Oh, right.
if I hear you so
assortative
far,
mating.
you've got two cases,
Right.
and of course everybody knows a journalist needs three
Well, I meant more than
to
three.
make a trend.
Right.
You know.
Right. Well, I talk to a lot of kids and a lot of families.
Okay, but so that's
Yeah.
what I want to know. So like you're about to kind of diagnose a community. So on what
Well.
basis? Yeah, I want to know on what basis do you do that?
Well, I was not diagnosing it. I wouldn't go so far. Yeah, maybe diagnosing them as having traits. I mean, I'm still pretty much of a stickler about that. Like people like Temple Grandin says, you know, everybody I meet in Silicon Valley has autism. You know, not really. You know,
But we're still back in.
Right.
We've evolved.
Right.
Terminology has evolved. Consciousness has evolved.
Right.
Sense of neurodiversity has evolved.
Exactly.
But at this point, one of the reasons that your story made the splash that it did was because you were kind of writing the Scarlet A on a whole.
Oh, I don't think it came across as a condemnation.
No, but people take it up and they run with it.
Right. And it is true, I have to say, that one of the interesting negative reactions to my work from the anti-vaccine community is that people say that because I say that autism is primarily genetic, which is mainstream science at this point, they say I'm blaming parents, which is really interesting psychological trip that comes out of the long and torturous history of being autism parents, which I wrote about. But
I'm going to pull you back again. I want to keep you on working.
Okay.
So,
all right.
wait a minute. So, all right. So the story comes out. It's great. It makes a splash.
Right.
It spawns a lot of follow-ups by other people. Other people copy it in their own way.
Right.
It sets a kind of new Silicon Valley cliche. I mean that in a good way. Cliche.
Well, the cliche was also coming out in microserves.
Widely shared half-truth.
Right.
You know.
Right. Exactly. Right.
So, for you, okay, the work is done. The story's run.
Right. But what happened?
On to something next.
And I went on to something next, but what happened was, you know, I kept getting email about that article for years and years and years. And the email was very heartfelt, and it was like, you know, I recognized that I was autistic from reading that article. I mean, like many, many, many people. I mean, I was getting email about that article for at least 10 years. And I mean, like, still like at least every month, often every week. And so, and at the time, a lot of people told me, you should write a book about autism. But I didn't feel like it was right. Like I felt like it was too early. And in fact, I have to say, when I wrote the proposal, which was endless, It was 108-page proposal.
Right.
It's true.
Yeah, I know.
Right. When I wrote the proposal for this, I still wondered if it was too early.
Yet
actually.
you opened a file.
Oh yes,
You
I did.
opened a
very
file.
important. Very important.
And you called it Neurodiversity.
Yes,
or
neurodiversity book. Yeah, that's true.
And you
Which
started
tips my
putting-
hand a little bit, actually.
Started putting
Yeah.
things in the file.
I did. No, I did that. You know, the article came out. I get this email. People are telling me I should write a book. So I thought, okay, maybe I will eventually write a book. So I started salting away news stories about autism, basically, no matter what they were about. Like, unless I thought it was total BS, of which there was a lot, you know, I would put interesting articles about autism or autistic people into this file. And by the time I wrote the proposal, it was an enormous file. I haven't looked at it lately, but you know, gigs, like really a lot of information.
Okay.
And I also had, yeah.
No, go ahead.
I also had like file cabinets of stuff.
So I'm curious though. Many people, or a fair number of people, are lucky enough to write a story that generates some interest, gets some buzz, whatever. But you know, the idea was enough for the assignment, and that's
Right.
that. Sometimes, and this is why I'm curious about you and your file and this long 10 years
Right.
of doing other things.
Right.
This idea seemed to, I don't know, stick to your trouser leg. I mean, kind of like
Yeah,
one
it
of those
did.
seeds. What is it about it at that point that's resonating for you? I mean, you seem to kind of not let it go.
Right. Well, here was the thing. I was getting emails from autistic people and their families that were describing basically the challenges that they face in day-to-day life. We have to sue our local school board. I can't find a job. Like, these were really real day-to-day struggles. And in part because of my parents' communism, I'm always like listening for the voice of the underdog, or maybe that's also just the journalist in me or whatever. So it's like, wow, these people are really suffering. Meanwhile, the whole world was talking about autism, kind of. What they were doing was arguing about vaccines. So it was like whenever there was a story in the news about autism, no matter what it was about, if you looked in the comment thread, it was, you know, either, you know, vaccines cause autism, or you're a shill for big pharma, or, you know, basically every internet comment thread about autism for years would devolve into an argument about vaccines. And I thought, there's something wrong here. Like, it was just a sense that autistic people and their families were dealing with a daily reality that was not being addressed by this arguing about vaccines. Like, what did people do about autism before there was this big argument about vaccines? And that's one of the things that I found out for this book and answer. And what they were doing was they were trying to change the world to make it a better place for autistic people by changing laws and improving access to education. That's what the autism parenting movement used to be about when it started. And somehow, once the vaccine thing came along, a lot of the energy of the autism parenting movement went into fighting this conspiracy about vaccines. And that's actually one of the, you know, sort of the great tragedies that I chronicle in the book, because it, you know, it's sort of proves to be a dead end. I actually saw sorry, I'm going to go for one more sentence.
Okay.
I actually saw a column on an infamous anti-vaccine website that was arguing against making quiet rooms in libraries for autistic kids because it normalized autism instead of fighting the vaccine conspiracy. And I thought, like, really? You're against quiet rooms? You know, and plus they're also against autistic Muppets, because that's also, you know, normalizing autism. It's like, really? So I felt that there was this huge disconnect. Not only that, but from writing Geek Syndrome, I had a feeling that there was something wrong with the standard version of autism history, and it was no more specific than that. I just felt like there's something not right about this. It was like a gut feeling, and it really was. Like, I had no basis for it. I just felt like there's something funny about this story. Like, it's not. And so this book actually discovers what was wrong with it and fixes
So
it.
there you
Lee,
are.
can I follow up on
please.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
please. Where are you? Oh,
Here I
there you
am.
are.
Yeah.
It's the Mets jacket
Mets
is
shirt.
making you hard
Hello,
to see.
Dan. Hi.
I'm
Dan,
not the
please.
least bit embarrassed about wearing it,
Hi.
though I should be. So this business of the disconnect, I totally agree with you, Steve, that that is always a rich area for journalism, the disconnection between what the world perceives and what you, with your special knowledge about what's really happening, see. That totally resonates for me. It's consistent with my own book writing experience. So are really long proposals, which we should talk about. The problem is that it's really hard not to feel captured, not to feel sort of so, not to sort of adopt the community that you know so well, and it's really, really difficult to sort of walk that difficult line of sort of sharing your deep understanding of what's really going on without losing your ability to do independent analysis. And I've got to believe that that's been really difficult for you.
It's been really difficult, yes.
So how tell us some stories about that.
I can't come to you with a success story of staying fully objective.
Objective is a silly word.
Okay.
I don't think that's the right approach,
Okay.
but independent is a good word, I think.
Independent
somehow.
is a good word, yeah.
Yeah. So how have you managed that? Tell us some stories about that, and how has that manifested itself, and how have you dealt with it?
Well, one of the problems with autism is that there are various constituencies within the world of autism that are all basically at each other's throats, practically. And I'm not someone who thrives on discord. I'm interested in discord, but when people are being angry at each other all the time, it wears on me. And so there's so much anger among autism parents, among autistic people, and everybody feels like they've been lied to at some level. And the truth is they have, actually. I hope I figured out some of the lies and set them straight. But there is, as anyone who has any personal connection to autism can attest, it is tough out there, man. It's really like you get so much fire. It's like, you get fire from here, like you expect the fire from this direction, and then, you get fire from the, people you thought were your allies or whatever. And so basically everybody on the front lines of autism is burned out, no matter who they are. And if you speak, it really is true. It's like it's a major issue. It's horrible. And it's draining so much energy. Like, I have seen so many really good people who had really excellent blogs, like about, autism science or whatever. They can't take it anymore. They can't take being hated so much anymore, and it's really difficult, yes.
Oh, wait, can you please wait for the microphone?
Sorry.
Can I hand you the mic first? Hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Thanks.
One of the other things that's really interesting to consider is that when you take into account the percentage of the autistic population that has executive dysfunction, so people who require a phone to remember what time it is and whether they should dress in a t-shirt or a jacket today, or is it Tuesday and is this New York? And yet, because it's on us to advocate for ourselves, we're having to deal with that quagmire on top of the fact that everybody wants to pathologize, well, not everybody, but many people want to pathologize us.
Right.
And furthermore, there's infighting in the community itself, and the parents don't want to hear from us, and they just say terrible things. And it's like, I admire the self-advocate community so much, because somehow through all of that, through the chronic illness, through everything else, they somehow manage to keep pushing the envelope.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me just broaden that for a second, and then we'll come to you. I wonder, there are a number of areas now that science journalists, medical writers confront as matters of coverage. You're describing the very choppy waters of the autism conversation, and I want to get back to the science communication issues with that in a minute. But certainly, you know, if you stick your head up one way or the other in a coverage of genetically modified organisms,
Right.
or
Climate change.
Climate change.
Yeah.
You will lose body parts.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I wonder, in your case, if I can just kind of bring it up a bit, how do you persist? How do you armor yourself?
I'm still figuring that out because it's still happening. You know, it's like some of the email I get is pretty intense, I have to say. But I'll be blunt. While I was writing this book, I was waking up at 3 in the morning with panic attacks on a regular basis. I never got panic attacks before. I would wake up, like I thought of myself as a pretty mellow guy. I meditate, you know. I was waking up like every night in a cold sweat. Like, you know, my husband had to wash the pillowcase more because I would have I was terrified that no matter what I did, everyone would hate this book, no matter what I did. The parents would hate it, the autistic people would hate it, that everyone I was talking to and was earning the trust of would hate it. You know, like everybody would feel betrayed. I was absolutely certain of that, practically. And so it was almost like driving into a brick wall. In fact, I used to think of that. There's a brick wall about 50 miles up the road. I'm driving right towards it, you know. And as the writing process went on and on, as my editor, who's here, can attest.
Yes, and I'm going to drag her into it in a minute. But
right. I felt like I was headed off a cliff for a certain disaster. And when she was the first person to read it, I'm supposed to say, my husband read every chapter. No, he didn't. You know, he doesn't care. I mean, he reads the stuff later. But when she read the few chapters and liked it, it was like she was the first person to A, read it, and B, like it. I was like, I cried when I got a text message, actually. But
yeah.
Hi.
Please, yeah.
My name is Dina Gassner, and I'm an autistic, and I'm the parent of a 26-year-old. And I'm also a PhD student at Adelphi. And so speaking out of the School of Social Work, I wanted to just express that there is a movement in academia for us to bring down that wall of proposed objectivity. That going back to standpoint theory and feminist theory, that the person who has the voice is the privileged voice. And I think the reason the book worked and the reason we're seeing a shift in the whole research community in autism is because we're finally seeing autistic researchers. And we are using our voices to inform our research as compared to trying to maintain this objectivity that denies that intense need to connect with this misunderstood community. And that's what Steve has done by engaging with us instead of studying us. And that's why I think people are respecting his work. But I also think that we're going to see a wave of autistic researchers. There's a team of 4 of us that are going to be presenting at MFAR this year to say we need the qualitative experience to inform this research because there's too big of a void between the research bench and the people who are living this life every day.
That's true. And I recently was in England and met the head of Autistica, which is a major research organization. I talked to him for half an hour.
We'll be behind you.
Oh yeah, cool. And I'll confess, when I was talking to him, I thought, oh, it's some neurotypical guy who's heading up this. He's autistic. His parents were told that he should be in an institution when he was young. And yes, that is changing.
She said something very interesting that I want to linger on for a minute. She said engaged rather than study.
Yeah.
Now, as journalists, engaged rather than study, it can maybe pose a dilemma, we're going to lose ourselves a little bit, cloud our vision. I mean, how do you, first of all, just how do you feel about that? I mean, engaged rather than study.
Well.
And is study for us then a form of self-deception or a form of distancing?
I'll tell you the moment that I started engaging, you could say. One of the first things that I did to research the book was to go to an autistic retreat called Autreat, which was about 70 people on the spectrum of all ages and at all points on the spectrum, except the spectrum is not linear. I don't like to say points, but all different kinds of people, really different from each other. Some people couldn't talk. Some people only said one thing the whole week. So there I was. I was one of the very few neurotypical people there. I had to come out as neurotypical at some moment. It was a trip. I hadn't felt so anxious like since I was in high school, coming out as gay. It was like, oh, are they going to figure it out? You know? I also had a very interesting moment when I got to the desk to register, which was the young, the student behind the desk handling the registration was talking to me in baby voice, like, oh, hi, you go over there and your room is, I'm like, God, like, like, is she talking to everybody this way? She probably was, So anyway, so there I was at Autry, and a number of marvelous things happened, like there was a guy I talked to the night before. The following morning I saw him in the cafeteria. I said, hey man, how'd you sleep? And he said, why? And I realized, like, oh my God, I put so much energy into trying to be charming. Like, it was like, by the end of Autry, I practically have never been more relaxed. Another thing is that, I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm overweight. And, nobody cared at Autry, or maybe they cared, I don't know, but it was like everybody, people are flapping their hands over there, they're rocking back and forth over there. It's like, people are not like walking around like, okay, is everybody like hip enough to be here? Like, it wasn't like that. It was one of the most... Right, exactly, right.
Nice.
Excellent,
nice.
Excellent.
Social nudist camp.
Yeah, that's excellent. So it was one of the most liberating environments I've ever been in. But here's,
That's
I'll
right.
get back to the work.
Yeah.
Here's the deal. When I went back to work on my proposal, after that, there I am writing about, autistic people are like this, and they're like that, and they're, they have trouble parsing humor. What? Like, at some point I realized, like, all of this inherited language, and my head was full of inherited language. Like, when I spoke, it was all this propaganda, actually, clinical descriptions from, case histories or whatever, coming out of my mouth. It's like, wait a minute, stop. I was just with those people. They're not like that, And I mean, they are like something, but they're not like that, And so that was the moment when I said, I have got to find fresh language to describe autistic people. And here's the thing. The editorial decision that I made that I most feared my editor would say, are you out of your bloody mind? Was opening the book with a description of Henry Cavendish in the 18th century. Because what I thought my editor... Yeah, and I thought my editor would say, you've got to start with a mom. Who do you think is going to be reading this book,
Okay, so we need a reality check. So, Dan, you have the microphone? No, but his editor is here. Oh, okay. I would like to just, and then we'll get back, okay, I promise.
Okay, reality check.
Reality check.
Megan.
Right.
Paging Megan Newman.
So the 108-page proposal
Oh, God.
lands on your desk.
Oy.
And I'm just curious, you deal with a lot of different kinds of writers. I've talked to you a little bit. You're a patient person. 108 pages. Oh my God.
I don't even remember that, quite frankly, because it's not like I never see 108-page proposals. And Steve, first, I mean, the information is interesting. I've always been interested as...
Is it on? Just
Oh.
a second. Yeah. Yeah.
As
Yeah.
one of the
There you
commenters,
go.
the woman
Editors
over
are
there.
used to speaking through other people.
Yes.
It's hard.
The pathologizing of human behavior is something that has always interested me. And, what Steve touched on in his proposal was about that, very topic in addition to what is autism. But quite frankly, between the delivery of the proposal to my first reading of the manuscript, years had passed.
It's true. Years
No.
had passed. It's
Let's
true.
share with us how many years?
Five.
Five. Yes.
Five.
Yeah.
Just 5.
And
Yeah.
he had promised to actually, I say this kind of with a contractual meaning, he had promised to deliver this
I'm
in
guessing
about how long?
18 months.
18 months.
Yes, and which I thought was very generous at the time. And let me cop to this. I'm a journalist. I'm used to deadlines. I used to be really good at making deadlines. So when a deadline was coming up for Megan, I wanted to kill myself. I'm halfway through the first chapter and my first deadline is coming. You know, really, I felt ashamed.
So 5 years.
I think 5 years is pretty short myself.
Yeah.
I just want to say that.
Dan,
Good to know.
Dan, just remind some of us how long you worked on Tom's River.
I don't have enough fingers.
Yeah.
How long did you work on it, actually? I'm really curious.
6 years.
Yeah,
6 years. Yeah. And
It's probably true.
I think it's evidence that what takes time is worthwhile. So, but I'd like to thank you for your patience and come back to your question.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Brian Kinghorn. I'm a grad student at Columbia University. I am on the spectrum myself. I'm getting interested in advocating for neurodiversity. In fact, I just started a pilot group there in Columbia's Grad School of Education, looking at it from a learning perspective. I have a lot of friends, colleagues who are clinical psychologists, and like they're really getting into it. So especially a lot of them, getting tired of seeing how things are pathologized. So it's an interesting perspective. I did a TEDx talk myself, and read stuff by Steve is very much an influence on me. One thing that keeps coming back to my mind, though, is a lot of the panic about calling it an epidemic, and how some of the figures, like Connor started with was it 4 in 1,000 or something low. Where did you even come up with that number? Did you just kind of
Well, no, Connor actually, Leo Connor was the guy who took the credit for discovering autism in 1943. The 4.5 in 10,000 estimate of autism prevalence, which is the bottom of the hockey stick graph in all the fear-mongering memes on Facebook, that was extrapolated from Connor's criteria by the first autism prevalence studies, which, by the way, were not done until the late 1960s, early 1970s. So 3 decades had gone by before anybody did a basic study of autism prevalence. Guess what? Nobody's done a study of prevalence among adults in the United States. Somebody did in the United Kingdom, however. Guess what? The proportion of autistic adults, both diagnosed and undiagnosed in the community, is exactly the same as the proportion estimated among children, which would seem to suggest that there's no tsunami of autism.
But I'd like to add a note to that, because my field is statistics, and I have looked at the numbers from the CDC, did a little linear regression analysis on it, just plopped it in. They like to put it as it's 1 in 200, then 1 in 100, 1 in 88. And it sounds big, when you look at those numbers, but just plop it into your calculator, and we're looking at numbers that are slightly less than 1% to the current figures, like 1.47%. And when I just ran it through, if you actually just look at the dots, it's a very slow, very not so steep linear line. It's at 0.08%, that's a fraction of a percent per year, meaning we'll be at 1.55%, 1.63. It is very small, it is very slow. I mean, that's smaller than most minorities based off of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. I mean, the way they put it, until you actually look at the numbers, it's a very slight thing, but I don't know anyone who has really bothered to do anything like that. There was someone at MIT, I forget the name, who tried to make the scare article about 50% of our children are going to be autistic. Well, according to my calculations,
MIT,
that'll take 600 years.
Right.
This is interesting, because one of the strong threads, and I'm hearing it from you this evening, because you actually emotionally, you keep going back to this. You sort of approach this, it seems to me, very much as a reformer, and a reformer in the sense of, I want to set the record straight.
Yes, that's
Because one of
true.
the things I think is interesting about this book, there are a lot of books about autism.
Yeah.
There are a lot of books, generally it's a kind of thing that we do, books about people who are afflicted with something and the search to fix it, and often usually figures not the person who is afflicted with something, but features the brave, smart, articulate, quotable scientist who is going to cure this in the future. You made a decision here to this is a book as much as anything about history.
That's true. And that's because I came to feel that the people who were really afflicted were everyone. Like parents were afflicted with fear of vaccines because they did not understand what had happened, the real story. I mean, I felt like I was really trying to lift this or relieve this fear. And the problem is that, particularly in America, in England they don't do this, autism parenting organizations glommed onto the word epidemic, like Autism Speaks, glommed onto the word epidemic, because autism parenting organizations were so used to being ignored and overlooked because autism was mistakenly believed to be so rare. So it's like, epidemic gets everyone's attention. So like, they went for it. But they don't realize that when they use the word epidemic, it's not just some neutral word, or it's not some word that says, there are many more autistic people out there than you thought. In fact, it says, what it quietly says is, there are no autistic adults out there actually, because it's a tsunami of children. You know, it renders autistic adults invisible. And once I figured out that many people who were adults in the 40s, 50s, and 60s either had no diagnosis at all and were struggling to get by and couldn't figure out why they couldn't make jobs work and whatever, or they were in institutions because they had spent their lives there, because they were put there as children. Now when I hear like, tsunami of children, what about the fucking adults who you're rendering invisible twice? You know, really. Anyway, yes.
If I might
please,
make a
yeah,
comment.
please.
Hi, I'm Carol Greenberg. I'm an autistic mother of an autistic child and also a former editor of both newspapers and over 100 science fiction books. And I just wanted to go back to the comment about deadlines and everything. The whole deadline structure in journalism, in books and magazines and newspapers, it's quite different. I know that as a book editor, Steve, I'm sure, needed to have negotiations in good faith with his editor about when to deliver various things, but it really isn't like newspaper and magazine deadlines where it's drop dead, has to be there by Tuesday.
But I didn't
It's
know
a
that.
different thing.
No.
I really, I
It's
swear.
entirely
I didn't
different
know-
thing.
Very good
Yeah.
point.
And I
Most
just
journalists don't
wanted
know
to make that point to you that I don't think, I think there were some negotiations going on in good faith between editor and writer that were perfectly normal for book publishing.
Oh,
I didn't know
should
that.
share and tell you that I've written a book, and one of the abiding regrets that I have when I look back on it is that I actually delivered it when I was supposed to.
That's interesting. Oh, can I say one more thing? Because I think this is an interesting thing.
Yeah, please.
The other thing that was weird about writing this book was that I started writing it right when Twitter was really taking off. And so the whole world was getting fascinated with fast writing. You can't get faster writing than Twitter, and you know, short form journalism and etc. Suddenly I was doing this thing that felt almost medieval. You know, I'm like working on this manuscript for 5 years. Like, it seemed insane. Like I was completely swimming against the tide. You know, and that's one of the reasons why I got on Twitter like so aggressively, was to keep my name in the news, because I was used to, you know, writing a story that, oh, the placebo problem, you know, everybody would talk about it for 3 days, you know, and so I had got addicted to that endorphin rush of being part of the global conversation, and then suddenly I was not, you know, for years, and so I thought I've got to keep my name out there somewhere, or I'll fall off the edge of the earth, and it also had to do with being as old as I am, you know, it was sort of like, the kids are going to forget about me, you know, and
No,
it's really true.
No. So I'm interested, because you're very successful as a tweeter, however you want to calculate that.
Yeah.
So did you go into that, I understand, the impulse to kind of, I need to keep my name
Yes.
alive. It's very important to a journalist, very important to someone for whom self-expression is not enough. Did you go into tweeting, did you go into social media with a professional strategy? Or is it just what your fingers do at the end of the day when you're tired and distracted and probably indiscreet?
You know, I was lonely. Like, you know, I do not have the story about how I wrote this book and I was on the treadmill every day and then I went and had a charming dinner with my friends. I was living like a miserable monk. I'll tell you a quick story. My watch kept stopping while I was writing my book. And so I go out to the store, look for a battery, they don't have it. I'll go to 5 watch stores on Market Street in San Francisco, nobody has this battery. Finally, at the last one, I say to the guy, wait a minute, this is a Seiko watch. It's not an obscure brand. why doesn't anyone have a battery for this watch? And he said, no one has a battery for that watch because it doesn't use a battery. It's a solar watch. You're not getting enough sunlight. So I was basically at my desk, like Megan doesn't even really know this, but I was basically at my desk from 3 or 4 in the morning until 11 at night every day.
Wow.
I did not take 2 consecutive days off for years. My husband can tell you. I became that ghoul in the bathrobe, who like never left his desk, And it's because I'm so picky about my sentences, really, it is. I wrote some of the sentences in that book, particularly in early chapters, I'll say, 500 times, just trying to get it right. And that probably comes from my poetry background, actually.
I just want to make sure that everybody in the room who's studying journalism listen to those last couple of sentences, because they're really, really important sentences. You must labor over your work.
Yeah.
You really must. If you care about your work, you have to labor over it. And even to the point of weird obsession. It means something to do that. It really does. And it's not necessarily,
No, I wouldn't advise it for your health.
Right. Steve's agent has spoken and would like it if the manuscript was delivered a little earlier and the checks were cut a little earlier.
No, but that's, yeah. No, wait.
Well, actually, I mean, it would be interesting to have a discussion about that. But different authors have different approaches. My approach is very similar to Steve's, and I know a lot of writers whose approaches are very similar to Steve's. And that is, you just keep staring and staring and staring at the sentence until you just give up. But it takes a long time before, if you're stubborn enough, it takes a long time before you give up.
Yeah, do you read out loud? Do you read your stuff out loud?
Eventually.
Yeah.
But it takes
No,
a long
I mean,
process
as
to get
part
there.
as part of the rewriting thing, reading it out loud,
for
putting
sure.
it out on paper,
Definitely.
reading it in strange places.
Strange
Printing it in different
places,
fonts.
Crowded cafes.
Yeah,
as if I have barely time to read this. What is this? Oh,
Yeah.
like to see if it catches my attention.
Yeah. Writing is rewriting.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's
Yes.
rewriting.
Ken.
Oh,
Yeah, but which question has the microphone? There we go.
Ken.
Yes, please.
hi, Steve.
Hey.
I mean, I've been hearing about you writing this book for like 5 years, back and forth, and I think one thing I would like to hear about is the fact that it seems like the topic was like a moving target. I mean, like you dealt with 5 years of the vaccination talks. You dealt with, growing amounts of research. It felt like when I heard about the book in 2010, what came out now, which is a fantastic read, is much different than what was initially proposed. And when you talk about this sort of like old form of journalism where you took 5 years to work on it, the project management, I kind of just wanted to hear about what you started with and how you got to where you are now and how you dealt with such, the quick movement of the subject.
I actually, pretty early on, figured out that I was not going to be able to keep up with the state of the art of autism research. And that proved to be like the biggest gift that I ever gave myself. So for instance, during that time period, the whole mirror neuron thing just came and went.
Huh.
It's like, so you had, even, like people writing autobiographies, I lack mirror neurons, Actually, no, mirror neurons was overhyped. And one of the things that I noticed was that once I got deep enough into autism history, virtually every autism story that came down the pipe was some version of some earlier autism story that had come and gone. So I was not chasing the state of the art of the research, particularly once I figured out that the nut of what I wanted to write about was the deep history. And I'll tell you an interesting story. I don't think he's here. But one of the smartest editors in New York looked at my proposal. And he said, I'm very interested in this, but forget about the history. I don't want to read about autism history. I want you to write about the idea of neurodiversity. And believe me, I respect this guy. He's a fantastic editor. But I knew that was wrong. I knew that I had to, in order to write about neurodiversity, I would have to go into the deep history. And thank God. I mean, that's what the book is. You know, without the history, it wouldn't be anything. It would be another, you know, one of these thin idea appetizer books. You know, maybe get a TED Talk out of it, but who cares, you know? Anyway.
So I have a question. My name's
Yeah.
Ryan.
Hey.
Hi again.
Hey, buddy.
What I wanted to know was, so as a neurotypical person, you kind of, dived into this world that, was kind of foreign to you. So what advice do you have for other neurotypical people on sort of how to help make the world, a better place for neurodiversity and, just advice for kind of, the majority of neurotypical people?
Well,
Can we just stand in line to kiss you?
yeah, that's good.
And also tell you just listen to neurodivergent people. That's it.
That's it. That is it. That's it. Yeah, no, I mean, eventually I realized that the whole world was having a conversation about autistic people behind their backs. And so...
Well, actually, right in front of our faces is
Yeah.
more.
Right, yes, exactly. And so, I would talk to autistic people,
What's the best way to listen also?
Well, the other thing that I've tried to do secretly, my secret plot to take over the world, is to, when people call me for the hot take on an autism story, I say, you should also talk to autistic adults. And so there are many more autistic adults appearing in news stories now, which is a very good thing, and some of them are even writing those news stories, like Dylan Matthews at Fox. He's awesome, and he's an autistic reporter. Mike Elk, an autistic labor reporter. So yeah, I mean, that's really important. But mostly I just try to listen.
Can you pass the mic back?
Like, would you, let's put it this way. I was in the awkward and somehow terrible position of, like, okay, I'm gay. What if a straight reporter was like trying to write the history of gayness?
Sure.
It's like, well, he should probably listen to gay people.
Well, let me ask you, before I get this question, let me ask you. So, certainly, the gay community has, in your lifetime, in my lifetime, had the experience of going from a diagnostic category
Absolutely.
to being, a normal member of the
I'm married, hello.
of the diverse human community, of the human tribe.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as you were either in your reporting broadly or as you were working on this project,
Yeah.
how does your sensibility as a gay man inform this sense of exclusion and diversity?
There are inevitable parallels, even though it is a very imperfect metaphor. Check it out. There are basically three writers who are pretty well known for portraying autistic people, three neurotypical writers, in humane terms. One of them is Oliver Sacks, my dear departed friend. One of them is Andrew Solomon. One of them is me. What do we all have in common?
That's why I was asking the question.
Yeah, we're all gay.
That's why I'm asking the question.
It's no accident. And I think it's because we all know what it's like to be marginalized, to be hella bullied. I was beaten up like almost every day in like 7th grade. So we know what it's like to be, on the outside and to be bullied and stuff. And also to be pathologized. My marriage was in the DSM, until 1974. The condition, my condition. But it's also an imperfect metaphor because, homosexuality, there's nothing like the executive dysfunction and stuff like that.
I wasn't heading it that way.
Right,
I just
right.
meant that sense of arc.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think that when I started talking to autistic advocates, that I had the same feeling that I had talking to gay liberationists, when I was young. It was like, ooh, this is new. Like they're refusing to be defined by other people. That was new.
Sorry, you were patient, sir. Thank you.
Sure, but I actually think this might follow up on what you just said. It's kind of the mirror image of Dan's question, which is avoiding being captured by a particular sort of interest group, though that's a pejorative term. Okay, but there's a flip side that we as journalists often run into, especially science journalists, I think, which is you're coming with news that most people don't know, and you need to tell them, but they have their preconceptions, and you have to fight those. And so, that's I think you worry about getting captured by particular sort of small groups, but you also have to worry about when your editor or your readers say, I want this to be like what I've read before.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, in the course of your, that's our job too, is to say this is not what you are used to reading, and don't give up reading.
Right.
And I just wonder, was that part of your thought process writing the book, and how did you kind of negotiate that?
So much so. The introduction I slaved over. I rewrote it a million times, and it was because when do I introduce certain ideas without pissing almost everybody off? Like at one point I had the vaccine stuff in the introduction, I had Andrew Wakefield in the introduction, but I thought it was actually really important. I still believe, this is like completely quixotic hope, but I still believe that parents who are absolutely convinced that vaccines made their kids autistic should read this book, because if that's true, then that's happening on top of this thing. This thing is the subject of this book. So the real reason for the huge surge of diagnoses in the 90s is in this book. And so if you're really serious about vaccines or other environmental factors, you have to subtract what's in this book and then look at that, and you'll look at it more clearly. Sequencing was all about, I was obsessed with when would I introduce certain ideas or characters. And here was the great thing about starting with Henry Cavendish, was that it allowed me to, I'm actually getting back to something I started earlier.
Right.
Yeah. It allowed me to talk about an autistic person's behavior before all the clinical cliches had crystallized around them. So I could see them through fresh eyes, as Henry Cavendish's peers would have seen him, which was to not understand why he was doing this weird shit at all, but because there was no structure to explain it, But it allowed me to look at an autistic person without any cliches, because they hadn't been invented yet. So I came to feel that was I was so glad, Megan, thank you, that you were willing to go with that, because I thought it was really important.
Mm-hmm. I recommend a book for you to put Cavendish into some context, proper context, which I don't think that you're wrong about him, but I also think that the English of that period had a much greater tolerance and a greater appreciation for ranges of behavior.
I think they still do,
and there's
actually.
a wonderful book by Dame Edith Sitwell called English Eccentrics, which catalogs the history. Cavendish is in it.
Oh, that's great.
But in any event, so to follow up on that, though, how do you couch an argument as narrative?
Wow, it's like the big Zen koan that we're all here to solve, Let's put it this way, I'm very into that. I'm not into just telling the reader what to think. I'm into showing the reader people's lives, and then they figure it out, basically, we hope. That's one of the reasons why the book is so long. One of the, I will say that there are various subspecies of criticism of the book. One of the interesting species of criticism from autistic readers is that this one guy, Tyler Cohen, who hated the book or whatever, he said, for a book about autism, it's sure full of neurotypical blah, blah, blah. Where's the facts, man? And I'm a narrative writer. I love telling stories. I'm a narrative guy. I think in terms of stories. And so I tried to write this is getting back to that notion of a disconnect. I felt that what was needed to heal the world, tikkun olam if you're Jewish, was a story. That no one had ever heard the real story of autism before. No one had ever found it. And that if I could write the right story, it might heal the world. I know that sounds really exalted, but we all think things like that, in the, at night, And so that's what I tried to do, but it was going to be a story. It wasn't going to be bullet points or a PowerPoint presentation. It was going to be a story, because I love telling stories. And there are all kinds of meta things that I have in the book, and one of them is people keep getting obsessed with autism, and they just disappear down that rabbit hole. And that happened to me, and I came up with a story. And halfway through, I thought, oh my God, I have to finish this book so that no one ever has to read these bloody papers again.
So, Dan, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I know there are a number of people who've asked questions already that have additional questions and or comments. That's great. But before we get to those, I just want to make sure that people who haven't asked questions yet
Yeah.
get an opportunity, and then we'll go on from there. Here's one in the back.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Steve. So I'm a dad of a 16-year-old on the autism spectrum. I'm also the uncle of 2 children who are also nonverbal autistics. But my son is very social, very communicative. And also technically I'm still in the closet on the spectrum, I guess, except for this room. And one of the things I have to ask you when I'm almost done reading your book, and I'm amazed by how authentic your narrative seems to be. And I'd like to know about your process in terms of how you create these stories that range from the Nazi extermination of children, the blueprint to the Holocaust, which really got to me, to Bruno Bettelheim's deceit, Connor's seduction by the cult of personality, and all of these anecdotes, and each of them which could turn into a dramatic movie, I would think. But I'm very interested in how you do this thing that you've done, which is eventually leading to wrenching our guts to see with authentic empathy for what we're reading. It's really quite remarkable. I'm almost done with the book, and I almost feel like it's taken a lot from me, but I wouldn't mind if the book kept going, to be honest.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I am interested in how people become themselves. That's my meta subject. How do people triumph over the things that prevent them from becoming who they really are? That's my meta theme through all my writing in a funny way. And so people, a couple times during this whole media circus, people have said, he was a technology writer. No, I was never a technology writer. I was always writing about human beings and how they self-individuate or whatever. And so what I do is, tell the backstory. Like, Connor would not have made the decisions that he made to limit the autism diagnosis so strictly and artificially narrowly if it wasn't for all the experiences that he'd had that led up to that. And check this out. The little things can have huge effects later. It's like the butterfly effect or whatever. The first paper that Leo Connor ever wrote was a paper, ever got published in English, was a paper about a Native American with untreated syphilis. And he framed it as, this is an incredibly rare case that calls out for explanation. He uses almost exactly the same words to describe autism, this heretofore unreported condition, which makes the anti-vaccine people think that autism didn't happen in the world until the early 1930s when certain mercury-containing pesticides, etc. So it's like Connor learned a lesson that he could really attract the attention of his colleagues by saying, this is a super rare case. Was it so rare? Well, I ended up looking at the conference proceedings about syphilis conference, about 20 years before that. Actually, somebody was saying the preponderance of syphilis among my Native American patients, was truly, astounding or whatever. So it's like, it wasn't that it was such a rare case. It was that Native Americans didn't have access to health care. And Leo Connor did not notice that or chose to ignore it. And so, people say the beginning of Leo Connor's landmark paper is, since 1938 there have come to our attention. Everybody thinks, wow, it didn't exist before. No. If you look in Connor's own textbook, he describes kids who were probably autistic, but it hadn't crystallized the diagnosis. And that ended up having a huge effect on the world, because people are still arguing about vaccines and because they thought it was rare because of what Connor said.
Yeah, so he told the wrong story.
He told the wrong
question
story,
yeah.
Yes, I'd like to kind of go back to something you touched on earlier, writing as a journalist independently, but also with empathy, if that would be how you would describe it, and how you find that space of what your relationship is to the people that you write about, and how you build that to be, to do your work as a journalist, but also respect the people that you come into contact with.
Well, I try to respect the people that I'm writing about. I mean, yeah, I'm kind of a teddy bear in some ways, which is a weakness, in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I don't have anything more sophisticated about that than that. It's just who I am, sort of. Yeah.
Well, just to follow up on what Ellie's saying it's really tough. I have the phrase that I use is imperfect, and it's I think of it as empathetic skepticism.
Yes. Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
I don't know, but people have a problem with skepticism because it sort of implies that your first instinct is disbelief. I wonder how you feel about that in your process.
I don't really know what I have to say about that. Yes, I mean, in that sense, I've retained my independence from the subject, in that for a while I'll admit that, when I would read writings by autistic self-advocates, be like, wow, this is amazing. At some point I started applying skepticism to those writings too, dare I say. Sorry. But, I no longer believed everything that autistic self-advocates said. So like if they would attack Temple Grandin, say, I would recognize that was something coming from youth, really, from young radicals who would trash a previous generation of radicals for not being radical enough without knowing how much they'd suffered and, had been victorious in getting to that point. I'd seen that happen in gay movement as well, Mm-hmm.
Steve, I loved the book, and you've done a great service to the autistic community and to the autism community by writing it. I'm Michael Wilcox. I'm autistic. I'm proudly autistic. I knew nothing about autism 12 years ago. And a little bit after that, I figured out that I'm autistic, got it verified with a clinical diagnosis when I was 60 years old. That was 10 years ago. So I lived most of my life being autistic without realizing it, sort of like the gentilhomme, if you know that play. Anyway, my observation comes from your conversation about the connection of, did it help you understand autistic struggles by your experience of being gay? And the answer was, of course, yes. And what it called to mind for me was when I was young, and a teenager and in my 20s, I was very involved in the civil rights movement. And one thing that I noticed was that of all the white people who were helping out in that struggle, most of them seemed to be Jewish.
Yeah.
And I thought later thought, recently actually, that it makes sense now, because here's another oppressed minority who understood what it was like to deal with exclusion and segregation and all that. And a different experience, of course, but you can empathize with that.
Yeah.
And so I think my observation is that autistic people have a highly developed sense of social justice.
Very, yes.
And I don't know if that's innate or it comes from this kind of trauma that we go through. But my question for you, Steve, is do you have any other observations about generalizations you can make about autistic people that you have obviously become fond of us, and we'd like some praise about things that we do well, or what?
I have to say, unfortunately, that sense of social justice is really, it should be in the DSM. Does she have a strongly developed sense of social justice? It's practically diagnostic, and it comes up everywhere in autistic culture. And autistic people, I would say, are offended by injustice, and it really bothers them. Neurotypical people, it's like, well, he had good intentions, didn't he? And that's beautiful and frightening, because there is a slightly merciless quality to it, but it's in the service of mercy. So, yeah.
Hi, I have a question back here. So in a media culture where you can find anything that agrees with your point of view, why should someone in the anti-vaxxer movement pick up this book, clearly written by someone who has a history of writing about science, and without relying too heavily on anecdote and also including the facts that you would want to include in a book like this?
Why would they be interested? Because what I write about actually happened, and it had and it's stuff that no one knew about until I wrote about it, and it really affected the number of diagnoses. And so if you're really serious about that hockey stick graph, which on the memes is always like, is it really coincidence? Are you scared yet? If you really want to know what caused, at least this much of this, it's in the book. And it's like, the anti-vaccine people can't say, no, that didn't happen, because it did, actually. And I have all the source notes, so you can check it out yourself.
Do you have any sense, Steve, of whether you've reached that community? I mean, one of the big problems we have is we just don't talk to each other, and I wonder whether the fact that you're focusing on history actually should be an entry point to the anti-vaxxers. You didn't write this as an anti-vax book.
And I didn't write it as an anti-vax.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I meant that's what I meant. You didn't write it as an anti-vax book.
Right. No, I didn't. A couple of things. One thing that I've noticed is that the major anti-vaccine websites have to lie about the book to get everyone to hate it, and then everyone goes to Amazon and gives me a 1-star review. If you want to read a bunch of reviews of my book by people who haven't read it, read the 1-star reviews on Amazon. They're fascinating. They're not only fascinating, they borrow from each other a lot. Yeah. But the other thing is that basically, here's a good story. The other day I was interviewed by a guy named Sean Croxton, who runs a podcast called Underground Wellness. And it's basically an alternative medical podcast. And so he was kind of shy about it, but really, like about halfway through, I realized, many of his listeners are anti-vaxxers. And, there are people interested in alternative medicine. And by the end of the thing, he told me that he himself had thought that vaccines cause autism until he read the book. So I think people who are honest about, respecting the facts and stuff, and I'm not famous for being a bullshit artist. It's like I'm known for being pretty diligent. And plus, you can check out the sources yourself. There's both not only the notes, but also an online bibliography. And so I think honest anti-vaxxers could learn something from the book.
Have you had any interaction with them, any sort of dialogue?
Well, a little bit in email. I mean, some emails I don't answer. But, the ones that say, someone who I used to know, I wrote a blog how I was a dangerous and evil man.
Yeah, but see, this is Dan's point. I'd like to just expand on for a second, and then we have another question here, which is that, you're a journalist, and journalists, how shall I say, are kind of shy. We want to stay behind the one-way mirror or the two-way mirror.
Right.
You're now in play.
Right, I know.
You now have
it's terrifying.
You now have a T-shirt. You're a position.
Right.
You're an argument and a debate. Because actually, the cool thing about a book is that it's like launching a little boat. Has a life of its own. It goes places you have no idea.
Right.
But your book is off doing its thing.
Right.
But you, Steve, are now a player in a debate. How do you handle that as a journalist going forward?
It's intense. I feel overexposed, actually, especially after doing like 50 interviews or whatever. It's like, I kind of want to get behind the screen again, sort of. And, what I've been doing with this brief spotlight, even though it seems tediously endless to many people probably, but I have been trying to signal boost autistic voices as much as I can. Because I am actually in an uncomfortable position. I'm a neurotypical blabbermouth who is speaking up for this community that has been long silenced. And, believe me, I'm totally aware that at some point, autistic people are going to be like, will you shut up already? Like, give me the microphone, And they should have it, Like, what I said recently was that I hope autism activists make me obsolete very quickly, basically. But, the one thing that I will say is that some autism activists have said, a neurotypical person should not have written that book. He stole our history. Here's the thing. That history, I found it. Like, I did the work. Like, I tried to bring my best stuff to the table with this. And yes, it's true. Autistic people should have center stage in talking about autism. And I'm really, one of the things that I want to do in events from here on out anyway, is to try to have autistic people foregrounded in events that I do. And I just did this great event for the National Autistic Society in England, where I was interviewed by an autistic artist named John Adams. It was amazing. And there were people in the audience who couldn't talk with headphones, who were making noise. That's fine. The co-discoverer of the autism spectrum, Judith Gould, was in the audience. Why doesn't that stuff happen in America? Do you know Autism Speaks, the major autism fundraising organization in America, has not mentioned my book at all? How many times, except to trash it actually, without mentioning the title, the soon-to-be former president or whatever trashed it in a blog post because I had dared to criticize Autism Speaks in an editorial in the LA Times. How many times is a book about autism history on the bestseller list? Like, you'd think that Autism Speaks would, try to talk to me behind the scenes or something? No. The National Autistic Society in England, autistic people were there. It was an autistic safe space. I was being interviewed by an autistic interviewer. England, in some ways at least, is decades ahead of us. Yeah.
So, a question here?
Hi.
Hi, buddy.
So, you've spent 5 years pouring your life into this book and your health to some degree. You've built up this huge amount of experience. What's next? What are you going to do with all that? This is kind of the thing that I have these grand visions of, someday I'll write a book. But then I get panicked thinking about, I invest all this time in this one thing, and then what I do after that. How are you getting back into the groove? Is there a groove? What is your life like?
I have this very calculated master plan for the rest of my life, actually.
And it involves tweeting.
Right, yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to have lunch with my editor soon, and maybe we'll talk about that. But, the truth of the matter is I don't have 20 killer book ideas, because this book was a very special case of the zeitgeist being at the perfect moment, And I sort of feel like anything I write after this will be an anticlimax after that, really, But I'll come up with something, Yeah, I don't know. This book still has a lot of life in it, and I still have a lot of stuff to do, I'm being, asked to talk to a million conferences and stuff. So, I'm going to do that for a while, but eventually it's I'll stop getting asked, and I'll be tired of talking about it, and then I'll move on. And, the next book is not going to be an autism book, I'll tell you that. In part so I can get out of the way so autistic people can speak for themselves. I don't want to become the most famous non-autistic writer on autism. No, Well, this week. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Hold on, we have time for a few more quick questions. And then hopefully Steve will be willing to stick around.
Yeah.
And we could talk more.
So.
Hi, Steve. I'm Marianne Zerscher. Right
Oh,
here.
hey.
Hi.
Hey, nice to see you.
Hi, Carol. I have two questions. The first is, do you read your reviews?
Yes.
And you do, even the bad ones.
Especially the bad ones.
Oh,
I read
God.
them 20 times. Let me tell you this though. I live next door to a guy who won the Pulitzer Prize. Okay, his name is Adam Johnson. He's amazing. He's a very happy guy. I see him watering his garden with his shirt off all the time. And he told me he never reads his reviews, except for the Goodreads reviews, actually. He said, it's goodreads.com. He never reads his reviews. Boy, I want to be him when I grow up, basically.
So the second question I have is, how did you edit out? Because even though this is a huge book, I know there was so much more that you had to. And so how did you do that? What was the process like?
Megan's red pencil. Basically, here's the thing. when I got the book back from Megan, I noticed that there was a lot of edit marks, particularly in the latter half of the book, which was written in more haste, I will say. When I first saw how many edit marks there were, and in fact I saw a dialogue box. All right, here's a shameful secret about this book. I wrote it in Microsoft Word. I did not use Scrivener, all the things that the really hip writers use. No, it was a giant Word file. I got a dialogue box that I have never seen before and hope to never see again in my entire life when I was reading Megan's edits. And it said, there are so many grammatical errors in the text from this point on that Microsoft Word will stop checking syntax. Like, who put that in there? So Megan turned out to be a surgeon. Like, at some point, like, whenever I was slightly bullshitting, like, she would pick up on it, get rid of it, And now I will say that it created some problems that even I haven't talked to Megan about, which is that, it was very difficult, say, for people of color to get a diagnosis until the modern era. And a lot of, I had more people of color in it, but they were all in the modern era. And Megan and I agreed that the stuff about the modern era was going on too long and that was where the cut should be made. And we couldn't really cut Connor and Asperger because it was so important, because it sets up the epidemic. And so that's a big problem, because I have a lot, it's like, when you try to explain, I mean, I've already had this blow up on Twitter, unfortunately. When you try to explain to people like, well, most of the cuts were from the modern era because that's where they had to come from, and that's why there are so many white people in the book. It kind of, it's not a winning argument, But the truth of the matter is that books are made by mortals within a set of circumstances. You can't just say, wait, I need another 6 months, to put more women in, And a lot of the people that got more diagnosed in the modern era are not in that book. And that's a problem.
I'm going to take one more. Sure. And then maybe right there. If you feel you can bear the heavy burden of being the last.
I'm going to hit something that's really nuts and boltsy stuff, which is you worked on this book for several years, right? You talk about going at it from, wee hours and nights. So whilst you were doing this, what did y'all do to pay rent?
My husband is a school teacher, so we were wealthy. Here's the truth. Like, the people who think, I was selling Grateful Dead collector's items at the record store to walk across the street to buy food. This is a really true thing. My husband was paying the rent. The buyers at Amoeba Music on Haight Street, if you know it, got to know me all too well for selling these Grateful Dead rarities, begging them for a little more money. I was so broke that it was embarrassing, And people would take me out to dinner. I'm now all paying them back, But we were broke. It was unbelievable. And San Francisco is not a cheap place to live, But luckily, my husband teaches at this school where Steve Jobs sent his kids, so it's a pretty good school, but it was really rough. And I have to say that he was a champ, but at the 5-year mark, it was sort of like, really? Like, because he had thought that he was going to be supporting us for like 2 years, and by the end of it, I have to confess, my computer broke. I wore it out. Like, the keys were falling off. I still actually haven't bought a new computer. I've been working on my little travel MacBook Air for the last 6 months. I mean, hopefully I can buy a new computer soon. But yeah.
Yeah, let's work on that next advance.
Yeah.
Right. So you were broke, but you have enriched us.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
That was absolutely great, and I just want to say two things. Number one is there's a little bit more food and a little bit more wine, so maybe we can prevail on Steve to hang out for a few minutes and do some more chatting with whoever's interested. And I also want to say that it was wonderful to have such a interesting, diverse, including neurodiverse group here. And it was just wonderful to sort of hear the interaction between autistic people, between journalists who are not autistic, folks from NYU who are interested in neuroscience. I mean, this is just the kind of interaction that really makes for better journalism and makes for a smarter society. So thank you all very much.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.